relate the habits of mind to the framework for information literacy, incorporate the habits into information literacy instruction, and then recognize how the habits of mind increase student learning and success. So first I want to talk a little bit about the theory behind the habits of mind and then start to discuss the habits themselves. So the habits of mind is grounded in the concept of metacognition. The definition of metacognition is awareness and understanding of one's own thought processes, especially regarded as having a role in directing those processes. So essentially, metacognition is thinking about thinking. And in the late 1970s, the psychologist John Sorry, one second. Everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, I think that was my fault.
Oh, no worries. Great. So essentially metacognition, like I said, is thinking about thinking. And the term was coined by John Flavel in his groundbreaking article, Metacognition and Cognitive Monitoring. But of course, the concept of thinking about thinking has been around for centuries and can really be traced back all the way to Greek philosophy. And in my research for this presentation, I wanted to determine where this phrase habits of mind actually came from. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a definitive answer, but the earliest phrase that talked about habits and metacognition is from John Dewey's book, How We Think, which was published in 1933. He actually uses the phrase habits of thought, which of course is very similar to habits of mind, but that's actually the first instance of that phrase that I could find. So then we're going to fast forward to 2000, when educational researchers Costa and Kallick published Discovering and Exploring Habits of Mind. And that was first in a 4-volume series defining the 16 habits that they identified. They also talked about how to incorporate them into classroom education. And initially, their research was essentially grounded in elementary and secondary school classrooms. But as the years have gone on, many educators have actually incorporated them into higher education as well. The most common applications that I found in the literature were mathematics and science, but they've also been heavily used in writing and composition curriculum. And this is actually where I encountered the concept of habits of mind first. One of the departments that I work with is we have a doctoral writing and rhetoric program at BGSU that I work with. And I actually heard about that phrase from them as well. So it is actually used in higher education now. So with their research, Costa and Kallick, their main research questions were how do students behave when they don't know the answer or when something isn't working? And I'm sure we can all have countless opportunities and times in our teaching when, or even, in interactions and reference, when something is not working for students. So some of the focuses and foundations of the habits themselves. So producing knowledge, not just reproducing knowledge, right? Sometimes we think about reproducing knowledge relating to the banking method from Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So the habits of mind is really more concerned about actually creating new knowledge. Not just having the information, but also knowing how to act on that information and use it once we have it. And also some of the other pedagogical foundations, mindfulness, critical thinking, problem solving, and reflection. And that reflection means both student reflection as well as instructor reflection as well. So now let's actually move on to the 16 habits themselves. So some of these I have abbreviated a little bit just in terms of space here on our slide, but these are the 16 habits of mind that were identified by Costa and Calic. Persisting, managing impulsivity, listening, flexibility, metacognition, accuracy, questioning and problem posing, applying past knowledge, thinking and communicating with clarity and precision, gathering data through all senses, creating, imagining, and innovating, responding with wonderment and awe, taking responsible risks, finding humor, thinking interdependently, and remaining open to continuous learning. So as we look at these habits, I want us to just kind of take a moment, pause, think about the ones that kind of initially jump out at you as being especially helpful in information literacy classrooms. So I'll give us a few seconds, and the ones that really jump out at you, why don't you go ahead and type those in the chat, things that you think, yes, I can absolutely use this in my classroom. That's a skill that's really useful in information literacy. Persisting, definitely. Questioning, flexibility. There's a lot, right? Great. Thank you all so much. Humor for sure. So of course, some of these relate more directly to information literacy than others. But as we've seen in our listings in our chat here, so many of these can enhance our teaching and help our students succeed both just in their individual assignments, as well as helping them to become more information literate people. So now that we know what the habits are, let's take a look at how we can actually incorporate them into our teaching. So in a majority of the research about the habits, as well as the initial collections by Costa and Halleck, teachers share the 16 habits with their students and have them very intentionally engage with the habits in the classroom. Now, of course, this is much more easily accomplished in an elementary or secondary classroom, or even in a college course where you are interacting with students on a very regular basis. Of course, with library instruction, it would definitely be difficult to introduce students to both a new framework and also teach GR learning objectives in a one-shot session. So I'm going to approach the habits as a tool for us as instructors to guide our teaching. Of course, using the language of a habit or possibly two would be easy to do, but framing these skills to students as habits of mind that we're teaching, it might just be a little bit too much for a one-shot session. So how do we actually incorporate these habits into our teaching, especially if our students are not familiar with the concept? So us as expert researchers, I think a lot of times we really sell our skills short. We've had lots of training, lots of practice. So the thought processes that we have when we're doing research have really become such a habit, again, that word comes back, that we don't even have to think about what we're doing when we encounter problems during the research process. And I'm sure for a lot of us, it's really hard for us to even go back to a time when we wouldn't know what to do when we encountered a problem in research. So if you're interested in incorporating metacognition and the habits of mind into your teaching, one of the first things that we can do is actually sit down and think about your thinking. So you could always take one of the searching demonstrations that you teach in the classroom often, or imagine that you're starting at square one for a research project of your own. And then as you kind of go through those processes, go through the motions, really pay attention to what's going on in your brain and actually write it down. And you can do this whatever is most comfortable for you, whether it's just a list or a step-by-step process, or if something more narrative, if that's how you think better, right? Anything that's more comfortable for you. And you'll probably be amazed at how many different steps and thoughts that you have just for one initial exploratory search. So once we've written down our research thought processes, then you'll have some language to incorporate in your classroom instruction. So explicitly sharing your process with your students will help them to understand that research does not happen magically and that experts have a very specific thought process that they go through when they're researching. And then taking that step to actually write it in your own language will make it a lot easier and more natural to add it to your teaching and your classroom instruction. So after we've reflected on our own thought processes, then we can actually start incorporating the habits into existing instruction, or if you're starting from scratch with a new lesson plan. One of the things I actually like about the habits, it's not necessarily, you don't have to like totally rewrite all of your instruction and do everything over. It's very easy to incorporate into lessons that you already have. So some questions to think about as we do our planning. What thought processes do I want my students to practice and develop? So this could be some of your own thought processes as an expert or other things that you have witnessed your students doing, whether in the classroom or in a reference interview situation. What thinking skills will be required to grasp the information I'm presenting? So this could be pre-existing knowledge they already have or skills that you actually want to cover in the session. And then how can I directly teach those thinking skills and processes? And this is actually where we come to kind of the nuts and bolts of a session. So it could come in the form of demonstrations, videos, or activities. So if we're using backward design for our lesson plans, and of course, this is where we first think about what the desired outcomes of the session would be. This is kind of how the habits would fit into that backward design process. So of course, our learning outcomes are the foundation for our session. Then we can determine the thought processes from the outcomes. Then we can actually go into the habits and think about which ones align with the thought processes that we want to teach. And then from that, we can actually determine what the content is to fulfill the outcomes and also design the activities that will teach the content. So now that we understand what the habits are and how we can incorporate them into our lesson planning, we're going to take a look at how the habits directly connect to information literacy. So if you're using the framework for information literacy as a foundation for your instruction, it's actually really easy to match up habits of mind with the individual frames. But of course, if you're not actively using the framework, you can do the same thing with your existing learning outcomes. So I'm going to take the frame of searching a strategic exploration as an example to demonstrate how to match up the frames with the habits of mind. So we can always start with the main definitions of the frame. So this is the definition of searching a strategic exploration. Searching for information is often nonlinear and iterative, requiring the evaluation of a range of information sources and the mental flexibility to pursue alternate avenues as a new understanding develops. So just from reading that definition, um, are there any habits that maybe kind of spring to your mind like, oh, that would really fit in well with this frame? And go ahead and type it in the chat if you have them. Yeah, there's so many questioning, responsible risks, so many, right? The great thing about this frame is that we actually have one of the habits right here in the definition, that flexibility. So again, we've identified several, but it's really cool when one of them actually shows up in one of the frames that you're working with or in one of your learning outcomes. All right, so now that we have found, so I'm going to focus on the habit of flexibility for this example. So now we can actually move on to the knowledge, practices, and dispositions of the frame to dive a bit deeper. So I selected the practices and dispositions that included either specific habits of mind or language that is related to metacognition. So for searching as strategic exploration, we see specific language in one of the knowledge practices about thinking. So we have both divergent and convergent thinking here as a knowledge practice of this frame. And then in our dispositions, we actually see, whoops, I'm sorry, let me go back. 3 different habits of mind in our dispositions. And I'm pretty sure we've identified these right in our chat of things that would relate directly to this frame. So again, we see flexibility, creativity, and persistence. So of course, it would be on the instructor to decide which habit you'd actually would like to focus on. And similar to learning objectives, I always try to really focus in on a session, try not to take on too much. Of course, it's always better to focus on 1 or 2 skills or objectives rather than try to cover or quote everything about the library, which of course we're requested to do all the time by faculty. So we've all heard the phrase, if you're not assessing, you're not teaching. Of course, assessment and library instruction is always been a bit of a wicked problem for us as instructors. We don't have grading power, and we typically meet with a class only once during a semester. So because of this, librarians tend to lean toward more formative assessment rather than summative assessment. So that's what I'm going to focus on as I discuss how to assess the habits of mind. So just like with any assessment, before we decide how we're actually going to assess the skills, we need to define what success or achievement looks like. So a lot of the habits are internal skills, so it can be tricky to define what success in thinking actually looks like. So the best questions to ask ourselves as we're trying to define these indicators of achievement: what does this habit sound like, or what does it look like? So that way you can determine if your students are working on their thought processes just by listening to them and watching what they do. So if we are trying to teach the habit of flexibility in a session with this frame of searching, students might vocalize synonyms or related terms for the search terms they've identified, or they might actually select a new database or resource if the one they chose first is not working for them. So I just have here some examples of assessments that can work best with habits since they tend to be reflective in nature. So that would mean that the students would reflect on what they learned during the session and how it has changed their view of research, or if it's changed their research process. These are just a few examples of reflective assessments that might work well when teaching a habit. So of course, pre-assessments, taking like either a comfort level test or a skills test with students, having them write about the point of the session they still have questions about or they're still confused about, general reflective writings like 1-minute papers, or retrospective post-assessments, which means that after the session they will reflect back on what they thought perhaps about the research process at the beginning of the class and how that has changed after the class. So how does teaching these habits actually benefit student learning? So in the literature, one of the main benefits of metacognition in the classroom is transferable skills. So how students will take the skills they learn from one course or assignment and apply it to another course or situation outside of the classroom. So in his article, A Dispositional View of Transfer, Carl Bereder says that the major obstacle to transfer is learned intelligent behavior. So if a student doesn't understand what they did to make an assignment or a course successful or unsuccessful, they won't be able to replicate that skill in the future. So by teaching students to intentionally focus on their thinking processes and identify the ones that work and the ones that don't, they are learning that intelligent behavior that they can then use again when they're faced with a problem. So what actually strengthens learning transfer? Knowing when and how to apply a strategy. So if we're teaching flexibility in searching, the next time a student isn't getting the search results that they want, they can remember that they need to be flexible with their search terms and know how to find alternative search terms. When students equate success with personal effort instead of luck or inherent intelligence, they can persevere through an intellectual problem and employ those learned strategies. And then if they can retrieve the knowledge they've learned previously and apply it to a new situation, they can successfully transfer a prior skill to a new situation. So if we demonstrate our thought processes to students, it'll help them understand that success is not come all from intelligence and luck alone, but through their own effort, applying appropriate strategies, and focusing on their own thought processes. So even though we've just dipped our toes into this concept of the habits of mind and the theory of metacognition, hopefully we can already see how these habits can positively influence the transfer of skills. So in review, what we've talked about this morning are the 16 habits of mind, how to incorporate those into your instruction, how to connect them with information literacy, how to assess them, and then how the habits increase learning transfer. So I did put all of my materials, so the slides, I have a list of the references that I used as well as some recommended readings. And a PDF, sorry, I'll go back to that so you can screen grab that. I'm going to put this in the chat as well as a PDF of the 16 habits, as well as some more definitions of what they are and what they're actually attempting to teach. So now we can open it up for questions. And of course, if you would like to talk to me directly about this topic, this presentation, I would actually like to do some further research about the habits and information literacy. So if you're interested in doing that and working on that with me, please reach out to me. I would love it. And then I will again put that link in the chat to my materials, and we can go ahead and open it up for questions.
I got one in the box here, Laura.
Okay.
How do you identify a habit in the framework when it is not in the definition?
That's a really good question. I would probably really kind of rely on our own expertise and about thinking about what students really struggle with in terms of research when it's not working, and really kind of reflect back on what we see with students and what their frustrations are, and then think about what habit might fit best with that. I hope that answers the questions. It's a pretty basic answer, I think. But I think if we just kind of reflect on what we've seen and what can actually help students with that problem, I think that would be the first thing that I would do for sure.
Yeah, I think, somewhat related to that is something I was thinking about is how have you done a deep dive on the dispositions within the framework and how you did a little bit of there I saw and how they relate to the habits of mind.
Yeah, definitely.
I got another one. Did the pandemic influence or change your
Ooh.
thinking on habits of mind?
That is a really great question. I believe that it actually underscored the need for some of the habits, both from my own professional and personal perspective, but definitely from my students as well. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen this in the past year about, if students maybe had some more experience with working on these habits like flexibility and creativity and all these things, that they can really help them be successful in other ways. So I think the importance of them even, you know, increased in my mind after the pandemic.
Great. Do you find some frameworks more naturally incorporate the most habits, and if so, which ones?
For sure. And that's actually one of the reasons why I chose the searching and strategic exploration, because it really did have, even like we said, the flexibilities there, creativity. It actually included some of the words. Off the top of my head, I think that I definitely know the ones that don't lend themselves as well, which is kind of doing it in an opposite way. And this is, of course, one that a frame that I've professionally had difficulty with is information creation as process. That one, in my own experience, hasn't lended it, at least in the work that I've done. I'm sure that you all have wonderful ideas as to how it could be. That's one that's kind of coming out in my mind as one that doesn't lend itself as well. And potentially information has value as well, because it's kind of a very different, it doesn't have as much to do with the individual thought processes as a more like a value statement. So those are the two that are coming out in my mind that don't lend themselves as well.
Great. Um, Another one, metacognition is of great interest to me. It seems to be needed for all of the habits and is also listed as one of the 16.
Hmm.
Do you have thoughts about this?
I do. I think it's odd because I really think that the habits of mind are really a type of metacognition. So I do think it is very, very meta in the fact that metacognition is included in the habits. So I haven't fully worked out in my brain how metacognition is something different, but I can see, like when I suggested to sit down and actually work out your thought processes, that might be an activity you could do with students that would be specifically about metacognition, and say, okay, now that you've done, this initial search, I kind of want you to sit down and actually write down the thoughts that you have as you do this. Um, so it is odd to me, but I think it can be done.
Great. Good. All right, got a couple more. Would you recommend emphasizing different habits each time based on the content of the session, or perhaps identifying a few key habits that you emphasize across your instruction
Hmm.
sections?
I think, of course, that would be a personal choice. Of course, if we identify a few that we can emphasize across our instruction, that's definitely going to be less work, right? Every time we do a new lesson plan. So I can definitely see the benefits of that for sure. Um, and there's so many different ways, right, to teach flexibility. Even if we think about one different habit, there's so many different ways to apply it to all different disciplines and sessions and learning outcomes. So I can definitely see how that would be a great approach, to just select a few and let's say these are the ones that I'm going to focus on when I teach information literacy instruction. But I think it really depends on you as an instructor and what your choice would be in that instance.
Great. Here's a, I, I'm kind of interested in this one too. Um, have you thought about how the habits of mind relate to Kutha's model of the stages of information process?
I have not, but that is a fantastic
Very good.
idea. And I think that it would probably work really well. I mean, it's been a while since I have, gone back and read The Stages of the Information Process, but I definitely think that that is a great idea. And there's probably an article in there somewhere, Jeff, if you're interested.
That's true. Now I'm going to go read those
I
together.
know.
It's good. Okay, we have another one. How would you approach training learners on metacognition if they are learning, if there are learning deficits or differences, or they have never had this opportunity before? I have had folks really struggle to think back and trace their thoughts, and have found that it may be something that librarians take for granted, but it's
Yeah.
not something that all learners get.
Absolutely. And I think that even reflecting on Dr. Saunders' talk just an hour or so ago, like meeting students where they are. And of course, that is really hard to do when we're teaching an entire class of students. It might be something that we could focus on more in a reference, a one-on-one situation, or like a research consultation session. Um, it's definitely not something that all learners get, depending on where they are in that spectrum, because it's not easy. Again, I think it's something that we take for granted. It's definitely not easy to sit down and think about your thinking, um, even from a personal standpoint, right? Like I'm the kind of person that has thoughts going through my brain constantly that I don't even recognize, in the moment. Um, so I think training students in that instance, that they've never had the opportunity. Again, I think it's about planting that seed and starting the conversation, and they're definitely not going to get it right in that first session if it's something new to them. So I think meeting them where they are, introducing the concept, and hopefully being able to work one-on-one with students, whether it's in a research consultation or a reference type situation, is how I would approach it.
Great. Thank you. A couple of more. I was wondering if information literacy itself is a habit. Would that be a useful way to be presenting it to learners? Disclosure, she had written an article on information literacy as a way of life and used the language of habit.
Definitely. And I know that Costa and Calic have even said, these are not all of them, right? This is just kind of where we're starting from and the ones that we are viewing in our research. So I absolutely would think that IL would itself be a habit for sure. And we could probably even, kind of go micro on those, right? We could even almost look at the frames as kind of those micro habits of information literacy. Absolutely.
Great, great. Okay. Question. In your research, have you observed if habits vary by different student demographics in the instruction sessions and or reference consultations regarding age or traditional college students out of high school or returning students, right? Life experience, these kinds of things.
I have not observed that in the literature that I have read and seen. I'm sure that it is probably out there. I definitely think that, of course, since the original habits were really kind of intended for elementary and secondary classrooms, that of course, if a high school student coming straight out of school is familiar with these habits, they're going to be like, oh, sure, I'm comfortable with this. I understand. So I think it really, again, I have not seen it done by demographic, but I think that would be a really interesting thing to research.
Yeah, it might be more of experience, or I've never
Absolutely.
had the opportunity to even try it.
Yes, for sure.
Okay, do we have any other questions for Professor Sheets? Any other questions?
These are great questions. Thank you all
Yeah,
so much.
we'll give people one more minute here. We only have about 5 more minutes left, so probably one more question is what we would need if you have it. If not, I'd like to have you join me in thanking Laura Sheets for great presentations on the habit of minds and information literacy. Thank you very much, Laura.
You're
And
welcome. Thank
I thought it
you.
was great